Kwe Kiji Manadut. Łutsël Indigenous Cost, Maquin Dodum, Shabatabajan, First Nation and Digaba. Chimigwich, Nibi, Chimigwich, Jojo Aki. Chimigwich, Anik Mishomas Banig. Chimigwich, Wabanung, Shawanung, Epanja Gish, Kamoj, Kui Dinung, Ki Mamo Pimarosan, Ki Nagig Gonanan, Ki Jigan Daganan, Kiki and Don Ki Makwa Menacing me Miga Ma Pimarosan. Chimigwich for the opportunity to come together, and Chimigwech for those sacred elements, that water, the air, the fire, and our Mother Earth. Chimigwech for the gifts in the circle today that we'll share in this discussion, and Chimigwech for the health and safety, not only of everyone in the circle, but of our circle of loved ones, family, friends, our extended families, our communities, our nations. And with that strength, I open today's council fire, our discussion, and I say Chimigwech, and over to the host.
Thank you, Elder Larry, for starting us in such a good way. Welcome. My name is Monica Mulrennan. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment and Associate Vice President of Research at Concordia University in Montreal. I'm also the research lead for the Indigenous Conservation Governance Stream of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, the CRP. So on behalf of the CRP and IISAAK OLAM Foundation, we're really pleased to welcome you all to the first webinar of the Governance of IPCAs series. This will be running through the fall and into next year. We also have a concurrent webinar stream on legal innovations, which launched last week. And the next webinar in that series, Demystifying the Doctrine of Discovery, is next Tuesday, October 13th, and we hope that you'll join us for that. For more information, you can visit the CRP website under the Virtual Campfire Series page, and you can sign up to be notified about any future webinars. Just to get us started, I have a bit of housekeeping, probably a bit redundant given how much time most of us spend on Zoom these days, but you have all been muted by the tech host. Please keep your mic muted while you're not speaking. To unmute yourself, you can click on the microphone button at the bottom of your screen or hold down the space bar as you're speaking. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. Feel free to post your questions in the chat box and we'll get to as many of those as possible. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the CRP website in the coming days. And the recording will feature the speakers only. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Justine Townsend, Alison Bishop, and Vanessa Cunningham from the CRP for making this webinar series happen. On to what is conservation through reconciliation? What is that partnership? So the CRP is a Canada-wide partnership of researchers, Indigenous leaders, and environmental organizations that are working together to transform conservation practice and support and uplift Indigenous leadership. Our partnership is rooted in the principles of ethical space and Tla-o-qui-aht seeing. Our goal is to advance the work that was begun by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, the ICE, and our efforts are guided by the Elders Lodge and various working groups. We are now in our second year of a 7-year work program that is being hosted by the University of Guelph. So the Indigenous Conservation Governance Stream that I lead is one of 6 streams of work. Our focus is on the deep, long-standing relationships Indigenous people have to their lands and waters. And there are 3 main questions that inform our work. The first of these is, how can IPCAs recognize, support, and in some cases restore the authority and capacity of Indigenous people as stewards, defenders, and carers of their territories? Secondly, how might governance within existing parks and protected areas be revisited and revised for greater consideration of Indigenous laws, leadership, and knowledge, and to ensure that there are concrete benefits for Indigenous communities? And the third question, a broader question, that addresses really how IPCAs might be embraced as opportunities for reconciliation with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together in support of really a shared responsibility to take care of the land, the water, and wildlife resources. So to learn more about our work, you could visit our website and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But today I'm delighted to welcome you to our first dialogue on the governance of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. As many of you will know, in their 2018 report, We Rise Together, the Indigenous Circle of Experts defined a vision for a system of IPCAs with Indigenous governments taking the primary role in protecting and conserving ecosystems through Indigenous laws, governance, and knowledge systems. In this sense, IPCAs offer an exciting mechanism that builds on the inherent right of Indigenous people in Canada to govern themselves, a right that's recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. Of course, the different historical, political, legal, economic, social, cultural circumstances of Indigenous people across Canada means that the implementation of this vision cannot be uniform across the country with a one-size-fits-all approach to the governance of IPCAs. So today's webinar will provide foundational concepts about Indigenous approaches to governance that future webinars will then build on. Each webinar in the series will focus on different approaches and models to governance of IPCAs. And later in the series, we'll feature examples from different territories and communities across Canada. I am honored to have been invited to co-host this webinar, and I'm delighted now to introduce our amazing panel of speakers. So I'll begin with Elder Larry McDermott. Larry is Algonquin from Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. Larry was a student for many years of the late Algonquin elder grandfather William Commanda, who created the Cycle of All Nations organization. He's the executive director of Plenty Canada, an Indigenous NGO that is a partner of the CRP. Larry is also a member of numerous organizations, including the Indigenous International Forum for Biodiversity and the Eastern Ontario First Nations Working Group. Larry served as an elder to the Canada Pathway to Target 1 process under a system inclusive of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems and governance. He's a founding member of the CRP Elders Lodge and is a member of the International Research Stream of Work. Eli Enns is the great-grandson of Łutsël, a historian and public speaker for Miʻkma'ki and from Tla-o-qui-aht on his father's side. On his mother's side, Eli is a second generation immigrant from the Netherlands, grandson of Peter Enns, a Dutch Mennonite. Eli is a happy father of 6 kids and 2 grandchildren. He is a political scientist focused in constitutional law, geopolitics, and ecological governance. He's recognized internationally as an expert in biocultural heritage conservation and Indigenous economic development. Eli co-founded the IISAAK OLAM Foundation and recently joined the board of directors of the Canadian Committee for IUCN and the Canadian Network of UNESCO Global Geoparks. Eli was co-chair of ICE for the Pathway of Canada Target 1 and is a member of the CRP Leadership Circle. Lisa Young is Executive Director of the Miʻkma'ki Institute of Natural Resources, the UINR, a leading Mi'kmaq natural resources and environmental management organization. Lisa joined UINR shortly after graduating with a BSc Biology from York University. She participates on a number of committees, including Pidopak Bras-d'Or Lakes Collaborative Environmental Planning Initiative, Mi'kmaq Forestry Advisory Committee, the Joint Committee on Climate Action, and the Advisory Committee on Climate Action and the Environment. Lisa is a member of the CRP Leadership Circle and previously served as a core member of ICE for the Pathway of Canada Target 1. Steven Nitah. Steven was raised by his great-grandparents on land around Łutsël in Northwest Territories. He was elected chief of Łutsël First Nations in 2008. He brought his community to the table with the Government of Canada, and on April 10th, 2010, signed a formal agreement to start negotiations around the creation of a protected area in Dene. Steven remains involved with Dene, working as a negotiator for the Łutsël Dene First Nations and engaging with various levels of government and industry to build support and validation for the Łutsël Dene vision. Steven was a core member of ICE and is a member of the CRP Leadership Circle. Marilyn Baptiste is the Xeni planner with a focus on water with the Łutsël Nation. She's also a member of the Łutsël National Governance Committee and the Xeni Gwet'in Language Committee, doing important work in keeping the Łutsël language alive. She is the proud grandmother of 2 beautiful granddaughters and is thankful to her son Ricky and daughter-in-law Dene for them. Marilyn is a member of the CRP Leadership Circle and previously served as a core member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts for the Pathway to Canada Target 1. Welcome to all our panelists. So in terms of the webinar, we will start off with opening remarks from Elder Larry, who will speak to the foundations of Indigenous governance. Following this, Eli, Lisa, Steven and Marilyn will speak to how Indigenous governance is being articulated in protected areas in their territories. After that, there'll be a Q&A in the last 30 minutes or so of the webinar. So as I said earlier, please feel free to share your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Thank you. So over to you, Larry. Thank you.
Well done with the introduction, Monica. And Larry, you're on mute.
There we go. Yeah, Miigwech, Monica. This has been a pretty amazing journey, but let me just dive right into it. We've got a lot of great speakers to speak. It's an honor and privilege to share this subject, not only this panel, but with everyone who's listening today. I think for me, the journey of co-governance began with contact itself. The impact, the process of very different worldviews, and the early settlers learned a lot from our ancestors. They learned how to live and survive on the land. They actually learned fundamental lessons in natural law that were written about, were regarded with respect in many cases. There were early wampum belts and treaties that recognized the value, the importance of both the worldviews and the need for respect and co-governance. Most notably, and jumping past a few centuries of relationship building. The fight for colonial supremacy between European powers culminated in the British defeating the French. But then, lo and behold, these upstart indigenous peoples, namely Pontiac, who took 8 British forts, Seneca, who had military victories, and other efforts to bring balance to what was a circumstance in which that respect was eroding, in which the land wasn't respected. So King George III issued the proclamation, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was a gateway to the treaty negotiations a year later in Niagara. At that time, 24 nations sent nearly 2,000 representatives who spoke about sharing the land. Yeah, there were military objectives, certainly by the British Crown, but the British Crown was led by Sir William Johnson, who had 8 children with a Mohawk clan mother, spoke a number of indigenous languages, and knew fundamental protocols. He understood that governance was extremely important. You got nowhere if you didn't understand governance. So how the meeting was initiated, namely pipe ceremony, the Crown brought pipes. The Crown brought wampum belts. The Crown understood the importance of acknowledging the highest level of spiritual and cultural recognition was through gift giving. All of that was part of those negotiations in this watershed treaty. Indigenous peoples brought forward their concern about trees being harvested too quickly, about overfishing, and a need to recognize that if we were going to share this land, that it had to be anchored in indigenous law. And though there were, even then in these negotiations, 25 or 24 iterations of indigenous law, they were all buoyed. They were all anchored in natural law. And I know some use other terminology, but I'm going to stick with the terminology my elders shared with me. And it was this very important governance mechanism that resulted in solemn promises before the Great Spirit in ceremony that resulted in very strong indigenous allegiance in the War of 1812. There were commitments made between the 2 military leaders, General Brock and Tecumseh, to create a pan-indigenous nation in the middle of the continent in what are now the Midwestern US states and the prairie provinces. And so at the end of the War of 1812, and there were key victories, I was just in the Niagara region and walked a portion of the Laura Secord Trail, probably better known for chocolates, but should be better known for her contribution in warning the British that a large battalion of Americans were coming to invade, and if they had been successful, that might have been game over. But Laura Secord was actually intercepted, ran into a group of indigenous warriors who then brought her to Lieutenant Fitzgibbons. Lieutenant Fitzgibbons turned around and assigned assigned the indigenous warriors to intercept the Americans, whose defeat and surrender they single-handedly achieved. And this was a key battle in the war. At the Treaty of Ghent, there was no indigenous representation. The Americans were kind of, they had their own dynamics. They had the Northerners who never liked the war in the first place, the Southerners who believed in manifest destiny, and who, when the British put forward the promises made between General Brock and Tecumseh, both killed in battle during the war, they were quickly dismissed. But the British also sent junior negotiators thinking, these guys they're not as strong as us. We'll send in junior negotiators and we'll come in at the end and mop up the situation according to our wishes. Well, that didn't happen. And so at the conclusion of the treaty, Article 9 affirmed all rights that had been negotiated and an appropriate governance model that had not been followed through on in the Treaty of Ghent process. And so there was actually collusion between the Americans and the British to not really have a enforcement mechanism to uphold those rights. And to me, rather than the Indian Act 1867, I believe we started going off the rails in 1815. Now, moving on to 1992, the Earth Summit occurred, a convention that resulted in 3 treaties, international treaties, one of which was the Convention on Biological Diversity, the other climate change, third was desertification. The recognition of the importance of Indigenous peoples in leading efforts to address conservation challenges, environmental challenges threatening all life was underscored. In fact, Canada had great influence on that. I know of stories of Indigenous people going to Maurice Strong, who was appointed by the UN to lead this. I was actually involved in some of that. So that was the foundation. In 2010, the Aichi targets were established. And so Pathways 1 was Canada's decision, its action to follow through on the targets, the goals and targets set at the Nagoya negotiations in Japan in 2010. I was there for that. Target 18 said by 2020, the traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and their customary use of biological resources are respected, subject to national legislation and relevant international obligations like UNDRIP, and fully integrated and reflected in the implementation of the convention with the full and effective participation of Indigenous and local communities at all relevant levels. Now moving to 2017, Canada established the Pathways 1 process and agreed upon a governance mechanism that I personally still pinch myself ever happened, that involved territories, provinces, and the feds. So Chair Catherine McKenna and Minister Phillips of Alberta, co-chair, agreed to proceed with the prioritization of Aichi Target 11, protected areas. By the way, Article 29, if memory serves me right, in UNDRIP speaks to the right of Indigenous peoples to have supported conservation efforts that they lead and be provided with the resources to do so. The co-governance model took a look at the need not only for Western written, but Indigenous oral knowledge transfer systems. That's, there's much more to that, obviously, but in this short presentation, I'll leave it at that. So the governance model also had cultural accommodation. And so we opened with a pipe ceremony. We closed with a pipe ceremony. We closed with gift giving. We brought in our drums, which articulate our honor songs, our laws, our responsibilities to the land and the water. Ethical space was incorporated into the governance, and ethical space included, for example, the 7 gifts, the 7 grandmother-grandfather laws, and we discussed those laws. We spent time preparing. Before we started talking about what was going to be populated in our reports, we talked about principles and our way of operating, and we ensured that it was a safe space, that when you were in that circle, once we did our ceremonial openings, which we did for all meetings and closings, then in that space, there's a responsibility not to take a position, whether you're a subordinate or the boss in the working environment. But in that circle, everybody was equal. Everybody should feel safe to speak their truth. I should mention the smudge and the gavel were seen as equivalent. Robert's Rules of Order and those seven laws were seen as equivalent. I spent time with both, and we have strong representation, very strong representation from the Indigenous Circle of Experts, but I'm going to quote one recommendation that came out of the National Advisory Panel that I spent a lot of time with as well. And that was in recommendation 1, that the recommendation was that all governments in Canada adopt a shared conservation vision that the 3rd bullet, achieves our collective conservation goals within a framework of reconciliation and the creation of ethical space. So it was incorporated right in the report, Canada's conservation vision. I think I better end it right there. I'm eager to hear what my brothers and sisters have to share with you. And I thank you for the opportunity to touch on some of my experience and some of what I feel were the highlights building up to and included in the Pathways 1 process. Miigwech.
Thank you, Larry. That was a fantastic account of Indigenous governance over 250 years in 15 minutes. Got to be a record. Miigwech. Over to you, Eli.
Thanks, Monica, and yeah, thank you, Larry. I always learn something new when I hear you speak, new layers of the stories. It's fascinating. I want to acknowledge we've got Danica, and I see Chantel there, and Eduardo, really wonderful, Margot, Lilith, Brooke, and a whole bunch of other folks that from the Pathway joining us. Feels like a little bit of a reunion. It's really lovely. Yeah, so it's building on what Larry has shared here, and you know, on the West Coast here too, my elders speak of natural law and how, you know, through observing Mother Nature, so to speak, and how she organizes herself, and how the sun and the moon interact with life here and really govern life here on Earth, is where we derive Indigenous law. And so, I mean, we say Indigenous law, but I believe that, you know, there are elder societies globally. There, here in Canada, the elder societies we speak about in terms of being Indigenous, they are Indigenous to here. But when I look around the world and I see elder societies and the teachings that they have as well, you know, many times you can see those parallels in deriving human laws through observing natural laws. And at the end of the day, it's good old-fashioned common sense, a lot of it, you know. And so when we look at Indigenous protected and conserved areas, we're looking at a modern day innovation which allows for the application of very old understandings of Indigenous law and Indigenous governance. in a modern day context where we're still exercising those relationships that Elder Larry spoke of from 250 years ago. I quote my relative Giselle Martin. She said recently that we are still in the period of early contact. You know, when you look at the depth of our societies on the West Coast here and across Canada, we have archaeological record of our societies functioning in a resilient fashion for well over 10,000 years here on the West Coast. And so when you look at first contact with Europeans in the 1770s here on Vancouver Island, that is a very brief period of time in light of the great deep history of our societies here. And so we are in a period of early contact. And I always love hearing Elder Larry speak about the time of cross-cultural literacy, you know, in terms of the diplomacy that happened, that was alive and well, where representatives of the Crown made treaty, but were sophisticated, much more sophisticated then, I believe, than today. You know, we have lawyers and we have accountants and we've got all the paper you ever want to recycle, but they didn't have that spiritual connection, that cross-cultural literacy that Larry speaks of, the ability to understand and conduct ceremony in ways that were respectful of the dynamicy of the cultures here. So my friends in the Łutsël have you know, they've got a poster on the wall in their meeting room, and it has a visual representation of the historical relationship and ongoing. It starts out with diplomacy. They mark in a circle that's divided into 4 quadrants. The first quadrant, and it's temporal, so it represents time. And the first era that they note is the era of Indigenous diplomacy. The second era is treaty making. The third era, treaty denial. And the fourth era is treaty litigation. And I believe, like Larry has said, that we've stepped into a new era of diplomacy and coming full circle. If you really understand what those peace and friendship treaties were about in terms of accepting King George III into legitimate standing here in Turtle Island, let's say, then, and if you look at the actions of the British North Americans since that time of treaty, since the Royal Proclamation of 1763, people have said on many occasions that the honor of the Crown has not been upheld. And I would go so far as to say that the Crown has actually violated treaty to the point that they no longer have a legitimate standing here. Now, that's a pretty heavy hand, but I'll say this, that this new era of Indigenous diplomacy that we are collectively embarking on is an opportunity for us to bring that back into balance, to bring back the Crown into good standing with the peace and friendship treaties. And, you know, Monica did a really good job of introducing the CRP, you know, and Larry mentioned the ceremony in 2017. One of the quotes that was spoken at that time, and which comes to mind when we're introducing the CRP, is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which is that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous peoples can never happen until there's reconciliation with the land. And so there's that two levels of reconciliation that are happening. And I think it's important to articulate that, because the word itself has become so misused. It loses its value and credibility if it's misused, the word reconciliation. And there's also an internal reconciliation, not to complicate the matter too much, but within each of ourselves, in our own communities, in our own selves, and this is on all sides of the relationship. We have an internal reconciliation, coming to terms with the consequences of generations of unbalance. And this is, as I start to conclude here, I want to acknowledge Marilyn Baptiste, who'll be speaking in a minute, but she shared a really cool quote from her elders in Xeni Gwet'in about the war on climate. And I think that we really need to air this out, because like so often we see the world in terms of adversarial forces. Adversarialness authors the history chapters, and today we have so many, we have adversarialness between Indigenous and Crown peoples, Muslim and Christianity, Black and white lives, and gender, LGBTQ, and there's just all this adversarialness. And the quote from Marilyn's community, which was about the elders saying, well, why are you fighting, why do you want to fight climate change? That's Mother Earth bringing balance back. She's cleansing herself and she's smudging herself because we've gotten so off balance. And this is how natural law works, right? I mean, if you park in the wrong place, you get a ticket from the city. But if you violate natural law, the consequences are intergenerational, and they're you may yourself never experience the consequences of your actions, but your great-grandchildren will. And so natural law is inescapable. And when we design through observing, in New China we talk about IISAAK, to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And this is just about being observant and observing Mother Nature and how she does things and how she organizes her economy. And then if we can design our own, our own law systems and our own economics in a reflection of that as much as possible, then we can, live the good life and, stay on the good side of Mother Nature, so to speak. And IPCAs are an opportunity for us to do that, I believe. And, having a network of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, I kind of think of it like a constellation of IPCAs across the country in key geopolitical and bioregional areas of the country, that we can role model not only what it is to have a good relationship with each other, but have a good relationship with the land. So I'll stop there and thank you all for your attention, and looking forward to the other speakers here.
Thank you, Eli, drawing particularly such a thoughtful account of the important connections at play here. Thank you for that. And over to Lisa next. Thanks, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. So I was asked just to speak about some of our experiences here on the East Coast, and kind of put some of the discussions that are thoughts that Larry and now Eli and Monica have shared to what's been happening here. And I guess I'll just start with the talk about treaty. So in the East, in Mi'kma'ki, we have a peace and friendship treaty. And when I think about that treaty, it was entered into with the Crown, and it allowed for peaceful interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous persons around trade. And it, when I know we entered that treaty because I think personally, I believe it's because we wanted to maintain that relationship with our land. That treaty guaranteed us the right to continue to fish and hunt and provide for our families. But more than that, to me, it was enabling us to keep that relationship and that connection to the land that Larry spoke to and Eli spoke to about where our values and our beliefs and our laws come from. I guess that's what we talk about, those things in terms of governance, why this idea around governance for this webinar is coming forth. It's that it's so intrinsically tied to that relationship and that responsibility we have to that land and our values and our belief and our culture and how we govern ourselves not just relationships with other people, but the land itself. So to my mind, those treaties were intended to enable us to maintain that relationship and our ability to govern ourselves and our relationship with the land. And they weren't honored. They weren't. Because despite having all these treaties, there has been so much attempt from the government at the time and even now to fabricate laws. I say fabricate laws because they were unlawful, really. They're unconstitutional laws that try to strip us of our rights. They try to make it illegal for us to hunt, to fish. They try to confine us to reserves. We couldn't leave without having permission from the Indian agents. And that ultimately was to remove us from our land. And I believe it was, and then to this day, it was all stemming from greed, I think. Pure and simple. That they wanted the resources and they were willing to do whatever they could to remove anyone that was in their way. So despite having these treaties that basically said we had a right to continue being Mi'kmaq, it's plain and simple, to continue to live as Mi'kmaq on these lands, and then that relationship and all that comes with that, they did everything they could to remove us and to break that connection. And our community suffered in a lot of ways. And one of the things that did suffer is that ability or that capacity to self-govern and govern ourselves when it comes to resource relation and management. But so there's been some recent cases, like in more recent history, such as the Simon case, which basically the Supreme Courts were able to acknowledge the fact that we do have treaty, like the 1752 treaty, that we do have a right to hunt and fish. And that's protected right under the Supreme Court ruling and by the Constitution. The highest level of the law in Canada says we have that right and recognize that right. In 1999, Marshall Donald Jr. Was arrested for trying to have a life, to live as Mi'kmaq on the land, to fish. He was fishing eels at the time. And he was charged with selling eel. And I was telling Allison before this session, we were talking about some of the great information that's coming out from our communities, just trying to educate people under treaty education, and this being October is actually Mi'kmaq History Month. October 1st is our Treaty Day celebration. That's the day we recognize treaty and we celebrate our treaty. So there's this really cool video that was shared by our communities. And it was Eric Shiley, who was one of the lawyers for the Marshall case, just speaking about the court case and his reflections on the case, and how Junior was, it was just like he said in his story, and I think Alison shared it, such a cool story. Like, people asked, was this contrived? Was this kind of set up in terms of, did we set out to make a point to make this case? And it really wasn't, he said. It was just pure coincidence that of all the people that could have got charged, it was Junior. And how he really didn't want to be, like, he was just coming out of the Marshall inquiry. If you know Junior, he was wrongfully convicted of murder and spent many, many years in jail. He was exonerated from that, and there was an inquiry, and he just coming out of that just says, you know, I just want to live my life, go fishing, and then he gets charged, and all of a sudden he's thrown in the limelight again. And how generous he was to our communities to agree to do this, and what he gave up for his communities by doing that. Amazing stuff. But as you know, we won that court case, and it just affirmed us as well that we'd also have the right to, I guess there was the 1760 and 1761 treaties. And I have to check my notes. Like, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert, but I'll tell you what I know. So it was those treaties that actually were referenced in court to show that we do actually have a right to sell, because there was, and those were the treaties that they had mentioned, the facts that there was those truck houses where they can go and sell, and actually, from what Eric was saying in the video, according to history, it was the Mi'kmaq who actually requested that be put in there, because even then there was a problem with the non-Indigenous people trying to cheat our people. They were doing unfair trade practices. They were coming with weights. The weights that they used, they were fake. And our people knew that, and so that was part of the reason they negotiated that, is so they can have fair trade and not get ripped off. But anyways, so we talk a lot about our treaty rights and our rights to hunt and fish, but what we talk about also, and our elders constantly remind us, is with that right comes responsibility. And that's the responsibility that we have to the land. That comes back to that relationship I spoke of earlier that we have with the land, that kind of governs ourselves and how we interact with the land and one another, and forms the basis for our governance and how we manage ourselves, and the concepts such as Nudaglimp and Imsipnogama, and our responsibilities to all our relations, and that we do have a right, a constitutionally protected right, to hunt and fish. We also are very, very much aware that we have a responsibility as well to do that in a sustainable way. And that's all captured in the concept of Nudaglimp. So you've probably seen on the news, a lot of commotion going on here on the East Coast around the livelihood fishery. And again, it stems from, I think, greed myself, and the Crown not acting in an honorable way, because that decision was made 21 years ago. That decision that came down that said that the Mi'kmaq have a right for what the Supreme Court itself defined as, well, I wouldn't say defined, but called a moderate livelihood. And our leadership, in good faith, sat down with DFO and were willing to negotiate, well, what do you mean by a moderate livelihood? They're willing to sit down at the table and talk that out. And 21 years later, there has been no movement on that at all. So that is why you probably heard that some of our communities have just decided to exercise our constitutionally protected rights to fish for a moderate livelihood. And you see again a lot of protest against that from the fishermen themselves. Which again is even when the Marshall decision, I'm just like learning more about this as this incident's coming about. After the Marshall decision, actually one of the fishery associations actually tried to intervene on that decision. They actually tried to get the Supreme Court to retract that ruling. It didn't work, obviously. It didn't go to court. It didn't make it that far, I guess, but they did come back, and I guess what they refer to as the Marshall II. Again, Allison can share these resources so you can hear firsthand from these stories, because they do a better job describing what had occurred and the significance of that. But basically in Marshall II decision, that is when they came up, I believe, with the concept of more specific instructions for DFO on how they were to deal with the Mi'kmaq in terms of developing regulation and around a moderate livelihood. And I'm just, I don't know how much time I have, Monica. I forgot to check the time, but I'll just wrap it up to say that.
You have more time, Lisa. You're fine for time. You're good.
Okay. Yeah. So my point for that is, there's always been pushback against First Nations communities, right from day one. Just trying to like erode and take away our rights, our constitutionally protected rights. And right after the actual signing of the 1752 treaty, there was still hostilities against our communities, our people, right from like 40s and 50s, like right till today, when even today, despite the Supreme Court of Canada affirming our rights, we still have fishermen attacking our communities for trying to exercise those rights. And yeah, it's they cry different reasons, like, oh, we're concerned about all kinds of things like conservation and stuff like that, but really to me, like I think Eli had said, like we're still in that colonial kind of first contact scenario. We haven't left that. We're still experiencing that. And it's unfortunate. It is, because as I was saying to my colleagues here on the panel before this started, Larry was asking me about what was happening here in terms of that, and the inability of DFO to come to a solution with the chiefs and exercise on this right. That we have some great examples of work that we've been doing with the province of Nova Scotia, working around moose management and forestry. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying it's quickly done, but it's possible, and we're sitting at the table, and it's being done in an open and transparent way. And I'd like to think it's good relationship. It's a better example of how things could be done. I would take the relationship with DFO as a very good example of what not to do and how not to work with your communities. But so again, how this ties back to the IPCA conversation is like what Eli touched on is we're also working towards the creation of IPCAs in Mi'kma'ki with the Nova Scotia government. And we see that as an opportunity to advance Indigenous governance, Mi'kmaq governance systems that we've kind of had eroded over the years for all those reasons I explained before. And IPCAs are proving to be a more, a better way to do that, or a very good opportunity to do that. And I noticed Dane's on the line. And in what we would call a more ethical space, quite opposite to the relationship we have with DFO currently. And it really is an opportunity for us to kind of reimagine and reestablish our governing system here. In addition to the land IPCAs we're working on, we just started conversation just internally with ourselves, with the communities, on the concept of a marine IPCA. And with this one, we're taking our time with this one. We're doing it a little more slowly because we do see it as a really excellent opportunity to create a Mi'kmaq governing system for managing of a resource. So we're looking at the Bredor Lakes watershed as a potential area, but how we're starting is, first we're going to talk with the communities to establish our own internal consultation process. We consult with our communities quite a lot. In all the work that we do at UINR around resource management, with every project, we make it important, like we make it really a priority to speak to our elders, to speak with our resource users. And it's really done by a project by project kind of approach, so that we don't really have kind of like a standardized community engagement consultation process where people actually get to inform our community leaders and what they'd like to see done. So with this IPCA that we want to explore, be very careful with my wording because it's not a done deal. We haven't decided if that's what we want, but we're exploring it. And we're using this exploration as an opportunity to establish like a governance. So again, what I'm saying, we're first going to talk to our community members and with them develop a consultation process. And once that process is developed, we then plan to actually talk to our communities and consult on them on what do you envision in terms of what a marine IPCA could look like in the Mi'kmaq context and in this particular context of the Bredor Lakes, and what our aspirations would be and what we'd like to see done, and like kind of like a true kind of establishment of our own governance. So yeah, I guess, Monica, that's all I have. I don't know
great. Thanks, Lisa. And you're right on 3 o'clock. Perfect. Thank you. That's a really powerful account of, you know, I guess the potential of treaties and the enormous fallout when, you know, when the relationship that is entailed in the treaty is not honored. But I really admire the resilience of your people, particularly, and I'm sure all our thoughts are with you during this particularly difficult time. But good luck with all of that work. We move north next to Steven Nitah. Steven, over to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I think we're all in the PM time in Canada. So, hello to the seniors and don't say, so we don't all see the hellas here. The road didn't take things on see. No, it's on you, no, now the right in see that we side like the no need right in see. The law did no on there. But the ecclesia started to see that was side of the like so the lot is see the started to just to reiterate what I said in Dene. Good afternoon, all my relations. It's good to be here. I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time today to share with us the wonders of IPCAs and how it's rooted in Indigenousness here in Canada, and what we're doing at the CRP and with our partners to advance the recommendations that was made through the Canada's Pathways to Target 1 of the ICE report. I come from the Dene Nation, northern part of Canada. I come from an area where we made treaty with the Crown on July 25th, 1900. It's also known as Treaty Number 8, NWT. So what we're working on here through the CRP is to talk about the different constitutional relationships we have in Canada and how we're using those constitutional relationships to define or reimagine or repurpose our relationships in and around the creation of IPCAs and governance, management, and operations of them. So here in the Northwest Territories, as I said, we made treaty on July 25th, 1900. What we agreed to do in that treaty is that we agreed to share the lands and the resources and share the responsibility for the management of them and sharing the decision making and also sharing the benefits that accrue from them, like we've always done. Obviously, the treaty that we made is built on the treaty that Lisa's people made, the Peace and Friendship Treaty that started in the Eastern Gate. And the concept of that treaty and what was the spirit and intent with which the Mi'kmaq entered that treaty made it throughout the First Nations country across the country. And I believe all historical and numbered treaties reflect that. It's not a cede and surrender treaty as Canada tried to claim. So, you know, Canada has done a lot of things since they made those treaties. And I believe when they made the treaty with us, they never intended to honor that treaty. They just needed to start checking off that box, if you will, by that point. So when they met our demands, they probably didn't push back too hard. You know, the special provisions in our treaty, for example, is that we're not be subject to military enforcement. You can't impose your taxes on us, all forms, and that we're not giving you the lands, we're sharing the lands with you. So, you know, all of a sudden the written version of the treaty speaks about the cede and surrender clauses, and that was that migrated into the modern treaties that my people are also in negotiations with right now, which is the comprehensive claims policy. The comprehensive claims policy is more reflective of the nature of the Canadian state, the colonial state. Laws of the colonial state were largely created in support of the economies, in support of acquisition of indigenous lands. Laws were created that are nullified today with the latest and greatest decisions in the Constitution, I believe. Having said that, you know, Canada, you failed. We're still here as Indigenous peoples. The treaties that we negotiated are instruments recognized by international body. And I think for the most part, Indigenous people have honored the treaties and are still honoring the treaties and are still desirous of honoring the treaties. So, you know, I think one of the steps that Canada needs to do going forward is put as much resources into decolonizing as they put into colonizing. Start educating people across the country about the treaties and the nature of those treaties and the relationships, so that people are not confused and ignorant to the realities of the constitutional relationships we have in Canada, so that they don't ignorantly create animosity between peoples who they agreed to be partners with. Determine which treaty you belong to in this country, wherever you live, and which territories you live in, and find out what your responsibilities and privileges are within those treaty areas. Here in the Northwest Territories, I think We've had treaties, and the story, we've had very little contact, so we were good. You know, I think Canada, the only real tool that Canada had to work with the Northwest Territories or northern part of the country was in their attempt to assimilate and kill the Indian in the kids is residential school, because they couldn't use population advancement. We're too far out of the way for that. So residential school was a tool that was used quite a bit in northern Canada. So many people that are living today are survivors or descendants of survivors. But for the most part, you know, the elders that I grew up with, my great grandparents were an example, were never part of that residential schools. They were people that grew uninterrupted through the culture of our Dene ways of living and knowing and doing. In the 1970s, I was just a wee kid. There was a pipeline proposed down in the Mackenzie Valley. There was a lot of opposition to that because that would have really had an impact on the subsistence way of life here in the north. And there was a big pushback against that, which resulted in the Paulette case. The treaty Dene took the government to court over their understanding of the treaty. Canada's assertion that they own the land because we ceded and surrendered all the lands and resources through the making of these treaties was received, I guess, not expectedly by the elders and the leaders of the day. What the elders were very, very surprised about was the assertion that that you could own land, that land could be owned. Land as a commodity was what shocked them the most. The end result of the Paulette case is that, you know, after visiting numerous communities in the Mackenzie Valley, hearing testimonial from elders that were around during the making of the treaties, Judge Morrow pretty much said that Canada, your assertion is not believable. You guys don't have a complete understanding of the meaning of the treaty. Therefore, the treaty could have been nullified. But the Dene said, no, we agreed to share the land, so we'll stick with that. So that's when the comprehensive claims policy was introduced to the Northwest Territories. But going back to the elders' position that, you know, that land could be owned as a commodity, that difference in worldview is right there from the Canadian colonialistic worldviews of the day and Indigenous people worldview that land cannot be owned, informs the type of laws that both have. You know, there's many laws on the Western colonialistic governments that they created and keep on creating to support consumerism economies, whereas Indigenous laws is one of relationship based with nature, regulating your own self pretty much within that nature, and what your responsibility is to nature that you're in and all life forms that you're on the top of the food chain of. So those are the laws that the Dene have, and it's informed by nature and the need that nature requires you to be able to have in that nature base. So how you relate, how you govern yourself as an individual within that nature is going to be informed by what nature wants from you. So for example, the bio you read, Monica's, is an old one. Tla-o-qui-aht Dene is done deal, as we all know that the bio suggests it's not. But in the establishment agreement that we have with Parks Canada for Tla-o-qui-aht Dene National Park Reserve and the Territorial Park, for example, that one of our Dene law speaks about you have to have the ability to protect and feed yourself when you're in our territory. That's Dene law expressing nature's need. Because if you can't protect and feed yourself in the north, you won't live long. For those of you that watch the show alone can understand that. So that law now is reflective of the laws and regulations that is Tla-o-qui-aht Dene. So that means that those non-Indigenous people that weren't able to carry rifles and bring their dogs and be able to harvest something to feed yourself and or defend yourself can now do that in Tla-o-qui-aht Dene. So, so for Łutsël to get to where we got to get to that law, we use our treaty relationship based on the Treaty of 1900, where we exercise our responsibility. The ownership or the creators placing us in that place gave us that responsibility or the jurisdiction to exercise our responsibility. That's recognized in inherent law or Aboriginal rights within Section 35. So treaty and Section and Aboriginal rights as recognized in Section 35 is what we use to negotiate a modern relationship with both Canada and the government of Northwest Territories. And we describe what our modern relationship will be within the geographic boundaries of Tla-o-qui-aht Dene. So, in the next, one of the next webinars where we'll focus in on Tla-o-qui-aht Dene as a case study, we'll get into a little bit more in the tech and the other laws, or nature's laws, or creators' laws that we use to establish Tla-o-qui-aht Dene, or that give us the authority to establish Tla-o-qui-aht Dene. I will explain in the legal webinar, Indigenous law webinar. So I'll leave you with that. Just to say, I'll close with the fact that conservation through reconciliation is the project we're working on. So I think the opportunity we have in Canada to answer Mother Nature's call, Mother Earth's call to have greater respect for her and protect much of the biodiversity we can within Canada so that we can contribute to the global human community to continue breathing and regulated through this biodiversity protection. We have an ability to go through a reconciliation process where we could start respecting each other for who we are and what we bring to the table, not informed by political agendas that use the ideology of hate and superiority to govern our interactions there. So I'll leave you with that. I'll see.
Thank you, Steven. Always great to hear about that experience that you've had, such a positive one and an important one as we work towards this network of IPCAs. So looking forward to hearing more in the webinar that will be devoted to Tla-o-qui-aht Dene coming up soon. So over to Marilyn Baptiste, and thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to give thanks to our ancestors for allowing us to be in our spaces in this time, in the snow mountains where I am, and of course, all of you across Canada. It's so amazing and encouraging to see the like minds and all of our crew working across Canada. Thank you, Monica, and thank you for all of the team and bringing us together. I just want to start by saying, as Indigenous peoples, as Tla-o-qui-aht, we are a strong people, respectfully working with Mother Earth in our territories, knowing what's there, leave for others, for their health and their well-beings, respectfully teaching our language, our culture, and our values on our lands and our waters, every day and all day, reviving this way of being from all colonial impacts. And just being who we are. And one of the important things I want to say that I've heard all across Canada is when we as Indigenous peoples talk about lands, we're also talking about them, the waters and all that encompass our territories. And that's important because a lot of times government, of course, as we know it now, are claiming waters as another commodity for their jurisdiction and their control. It's about getting back to the basics, exercising our Indigenous rights and title, plain and simple. Knowing where we come from is the pride of knowing and walking on the lands and waters we protect first. Our Indigenous teachings take only what we need. For example, there's a lot of worry and discussions and a lot of concerns, of course, around hunting and fishing. As Indigenous peoples in our way, when we are and we know our way, we don't kill for money. We don't kill to sell to our elders, and we don't kill mother animals who carry young. Protection always first. I always want to repeat that because a lot of times we don't get it. Like a mama grizzly bear, she protects her baby, her young first. We learn from our environment, we learn from our animals around us, and they are so powerful and so amazing. One of the things that is a concern, as you heard already in many of this discussion, is the salmon, the mismanagement of government. And with our Chilcotin run, our Chilcotin salmon run was one of the strongest on the Fraser River tributaries. And this year is one of the very lowest return of our salmon. And a lot of that I attribute to the commercial fisheries, mismanagement of the DFO, fish farms, allowing fish farms to impact our wild salmon, climate change, and the warming waters. Again, it's about mismanagement. And then there's the Big Bar rock slide. That was a huge impact, but there's all these other impacts that have been happening for so many years prior to that. There's been many different landslides over the years. And of course, a piece of what, as Tla-o-qui-aht, fighting since contact. Another important piece for us is we're not treaty. We don't have, and we have never entered into treaty with governments. Our people have been protecting our territories, our Chilcotin War from 1864. Our leaders, our war leaders, were protecting our salmon and protecting our way of life. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't be who we are today. And I just want to note that, you know, all around the world, I guess you could say, when the colonial governments have won at war, they call it a victory. When Indigenous peoples have won, they call it a massacre. They call it a Chilcotin massacre of 1864. That's not how we see it. And then I guess a little more details into a part of our journey as Tla-o-qui-aht people of Xeni and the Tla-o-qui-aht Nation. Back in the 70s, when my late dad was chief of our community, he went through the process of amalgamating our trap lines so that those trap lines wouldn't be sold. One of those trap lines that were not included in the amalgamation was sold, and it was supposed to stay in the family. In the same era of time and parks, Indigenous peoples did not agree because it did not include or respect our Indigenous rights and title. And the really interesting piece, when I was part of the ICE and the Canada's Target 1 process, I heard across Canada from elders and different leaders that their people also fought against the parks and protected areas because they didn't include our Indigenous rights and title. As a result of that fight back then, there was a Walt Disney movie that was made, The Bears and I, that Chief Dan George was the star of that movie with our people. And if you look at that fight, if you look at that film, it's amazing how it's like, it's the same thing today, what we go through over and over as Indigenous peoples across Canada. And look at Chief Dan George's people, our friend Reuben George down in the south. He's fighting against pipelines. It's the same fight. And of course, carrying on in our course of actions in protecting our lands in 1992, our people had word from one of our allies that the logging was moving in on the north side of our territory. So that resulted in the roadblock against clear-cut logging in the Brittany Triangle, which of course went through many years of court process, giving testimony where our elders, our people, should never have had to prove that we were here first. BC and Canada don't have a bill of sale. However, we went through their colonial process and we won as we know it. In 2007, through the BC Supreme Court, we had a declaration of rights to the whole court case claim area, which includes a very large area. I don't know the detail of it, but and the first ever right to capture and use wild horses for transportation and work. And here's the key, for a moderate livelihood. I love the courts. And of course, moving on in 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada's title win. Again, the first ever title win for Indigenous rights and title, or Indigenous title, to more than 1,700 square kilometers. A lot of people said we will not win, but guess what? We won. And the biggest thing that this Supreme Court decision means is that government and industry can no longer deny that we Indigenous peoples have title to more than small spots or postage stamp size title. Still a fight. Governments do not implement Indigenous wins, as you heard Lisa. 20-some years, and they're still in the same fight. But the government, on the other hand, will push omnibuses, several of them, to water down protections for industry and greed. They implement before the bus even stops or starts. And then, of course, we also have the Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park, October 4th, 2014. We declared, I say declared, it is there for us. And it's a part of an initiative for us to continue to protect our lands. And we're currently working on the governance and management strategies. Former Chief Russ, who is just now former chief, but Chief Russ is working with UBC class on land architect and architecture. Is amazing work that is coming out of that process. And of course, the amazing work and with our alliances. And of course, we have no Crown recognition, but that's fine. The Crown does not recognize, and of course, the municipality of Williams Lake does not recognize our Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park. But it is there for us to develop. It is there for us to protect and to develop our opportunities working with our lands and our waters, and for our future generations. Tla-o-qui-aht, the fight against the copper and gold mine, the Prosperity Project, 2 unprecedented federal panel wins in 2010 and 2013. We won with scathing reports both times. And many people told us throughout that process as well, you'll never win, they'll never win. And of course, just recently, the courts, again, they declared the project dead in 2020. we're going to hope it stays that way. And I just want to also note that the Tla-o-qui-aht Nation, as a result of the tidal win in 2014, as well as the 2007 Declaration of Rights, our nation is in the negotiations process. And a part of that negotiation process is a governance table. I am a part of the governance committee, and through that table, they have been working on our which is our constitution, comes from our elders, our people, and our duties and responsibilities, our obligations, and taking only what we need, reviving the strength in our laws of the lands that many of the speakers have already talked about. Many of those laws of the lands and waters that cannot be altered for our pleasure or our gain or greed. And they also have begun a Women's Council, which is also apart from the voices of our elders and our people throughout all of these processes, as well as wildlife laws and Tla-o-qui-aht water law, and then there's a food security sovereignty piece that has just begun. Some very amazing work there. And of course, with the Nunkai planning, with all of our 6 communities, which should be 7 communities, working with our water, and we're working with a UBC law student as well, who's done some really amazing work for us over the summer, as well as working with Dr. Val Napoleon and the UVic, Tla-o-qui-aht Water Laws Project. That is some amazing work coming out of that. I just want to reflect a bit on, I am timing myself, We Rise Together, the ICE report that we handed over to Minister McKenna in March of 2018, the day after our Tla-o-qui-aht war leaders were exonerated in the House, is very important, to me. And this whole ICE process comes from the strength of our elders' voices across Canada. That was another amazing and powerful process to be a part of. Of course, so with the ICE and the Pathway Canada Target 1 to protect 17% terrestrial and inland waters, as well as 10% marine areas, comes from the international IIHE Target 11. And if Canada would work with us in this Indigenous protected and conserved areas, they would surpass their 17% without a doubt. I'm confused as to how it is that we haven't, moved anywhere forward on that yet. I just want to say, of course, with IPCAs, it can be anything. Tribal park, it can be protected areas, conserved areas, whatever it is that you see, how your people, your elders see it. And it is also the recommendation to work with guardians, land guardians in that process. It is Indigenous led. And I also want to just, say that it benefits all of Canadians, because to protect our lands and our waters, our ecosystems, is to protect everyone. As you see in this time where everyone has had to stay home, it is helping Mother Earth. It is clearing the airs. It is helping that biodiversity. And a part of the ICE process, or the IPCAs, is ethical space that was already spoken about, which is a really important piece in this process, which also is a part of speaking to reconciliation. Reconciliation has to be about, what does that mean from our elders, from our people, from our children, for our future generations, not just reconciling on a political level. And there's my timer. CP and the CRP, of course, is here to support anyone across Canada in supporting IPCAs or creating our ICPAs, a solutions bundle we are working on through this process. And I say, as we talk about going back to the basics, just get out there. Just set out your protected areas and start setting down those governance and management strategies. We have different examples that Steven talked about, and we can share all of these tools that we already have in these different parks and protected areas across Canada.
Thank you, Marilyn. So many victories. We look to the Łutsël for so much inspiration, but I mean, clearly it hasn't been easy either. Lots of battles. And thank you for your comments there at the end. You really opened up the conversation really to, you know, what can people do? Craig has a question there in the chat, just asking, how does a nation go about creating these IPCAs? So I think, Marilyn, you started there with some really nice advice on how to do that, to get out there on the land. But maybe you could add a little bit more to that, Marilyn, and some others come in then, I think.
I would say definitely, thank you. And I did see his question in the comments, and I definitely, that's why I say, you know, for example, with our Tla-o-qui-aht Tribal Park, we set that out as an area for us to develop. And we set that down. As I say, Crown does not recognize it. Even the municipality does not recognize our tribal park, but that's okay, because it is about our Indigenous-led process. That is one of the very important pieces, because in 1994, which I forgot as a part of this process, Xeni Gwet'in went through a Chilco study and created the Tla-o-qui-aht Provincial Park, which is co-managed since 1994, but it is not one that our elders and people wanted to repeat. So I think that's important, just to say that, and to say that, you know, we have like Suna, Steven, and Eli with tribal parks. There's a lot of examples out there that we can work with. We are here to help and share our documentations, our process, and and allies. Having the allies and that kind of support is really important as well. Thank
you.
I would add to that, Monica, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Thank you, Eli.
Madam Facilitator. Yeah, I think the just do it strategy is really key, because we as human beings have such a powerful ability to manifest. You know, Larry McDermott mentioned manifest destiny as part of an American foreign policy or expansionist agenda. But I also think of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. You know, King George III uttered those words, and somebody wrote them down. A scribe wrote down those words, and they were brought to the treaty at Fort Niagara in 1764. It's the power from our inner worlds through articulation to change the world in the future. Now, the Royal Proclamation of 1764, you know, it wasn't like waving a magic wand and all of a sudden, you know, British, you know, rule prevailed. In our territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island, you know, the Crown laws were not enforced until 1909, according to the historical records that I've found and through the oral history that was passed down. And so you know, even the reserve boundaries, which were created in the 1880s, were, you know, the first Indian agent, Harry Gilead, to our area. You know, he said to our chiefs, you know, you can continue to live your life as you always have. Now, no, you know, and these were his words, no white people will ever want to come to your land because it's too wild, and you can't grow crops here either. You know, on the West Coast is not good for agriculture. And so even those reserve boundaries were not enforced until 1909. So my point here is that, you know, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 took, you know, hundreds of years to start to impact a jurisdiction. Now look at the Mears Island Tribal Park Declaration in 1984. So you've got 1909 to 1984, that's 75 years that our people lost control over what happens and what doesn't happen in our territory. And that jurisdiction was taken back by Tla-o-qui-aht, you know, Moses Martin as our elected chief councillor acting on behalf of our Hotwave, declared Mears Island to be a tribal park. It wasn't a submission or a proposal, you know, it was an act of New Charnoth law because our elders, our chiefs saw what the industrial logging had done to other parts of our territory. And it was, they absolutely obliterated the worst practices you can imagine for clear-cut logging in an ancient cedar rainforest, spawning grounds for salmon, just right over it. And, you know, we lost a huge amount of natural wealth that had been cultivated over thousands of years by our people. And so ISAAK is to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. It's represented by the sun moon crest in our Constitution. And, you know, when I talked to my uncle Moses Martin about that time in 1984, I was just a young kid myself, but, you know, he speaks about ISAAK and how ISAAK was, you know, not the forest company, but the law, the New Charnoth law. That's what the tribal park derives from. And, you know, when Moses declared Mears Island to be a tribal park, he was also trying to establish cross-cultural literacy, as Elder Larry McDermott spoke to earlier. Moses's words were words of welcome to the logging company, the staff people of that logging company. He welcomed them. He said, "We would like you to join us for a meal, but you have to leave your chainsaws in your boats. This is not a tree farm. This is Wana Just Hilthuis. This is our Garden of Eden. That's how sacred this place is to us. It's equivalent to your Garden of Eden." And he drove the point home by saying this is a tribal park. And so that the uttering of those words in 1984 led to the successful protection of those trees in that garden. And, you know, 36 years later, those trees are still standing. Now, there's a lot of work that has to go in. There's a lot of diplomacy. There's a lot of, you know, creativity that has to be utilized to build on that. And really one of the points that I would drive home in terms of, you know, how to go from just, you know, saying it out loud to making it happen is finding alternatives. And that was one of the first things that Moses said to me when I started doing the work of tribal parks, is he said, you know, we need to have alternatives. Our people as well rely on those jobs, and you know, we need to create alternatives. And if we have healthy alternatives that people can provide for themselves and for their families, and do it in a way that they can feel good about themselves at the end of the day, that doesn't degrade nature but enhances it, then we're never going to go back to those broken industrial models of resource development and extraction.
Thanks, Eli. Steven, would you like to come in on this particular issue, how to create these, what people can do in terms of next steps?
I think the message here is that you have inherent rights, and some of you have treaty rights. Those rights are enshrined in the highest law of the country. And you have the authority within the inherent right and or treaty recognition to define and declare your own IPCAs. That's what we did. We defined it first, and then we invited Canada and told GWG to join us because life will be easier that way.
Lisa, you are at the early stages of working with a possible marine IPCA. You mentioned the emphasis on working slowly, taking your time. Would you have any other advice in terms of a response to how to create these IPCAs?
Just that what I think I've heard so much from all the different people on ICE and just our communities across Canada is the concept of IPCA, in my mind, it's a kind of a placeholder name. You can name it what you want to name it, but really it speaks to the work that Indigenous people have been doing for centuries in terms of being the caretakers of their land. So in reference to the area that we're speaking of, are trying to create a marine IPCA is the Bredor Lakes watershed. But we've been working with our communities through our organization for the past 20 years. And even prior to that, even not in such a structured, official, organizational way, our communities have always been, and I've always been on that lake, and I've always had relationship with that lake and cared for that lake. So in a way, that it is already an Indigenous protected and conserved area. I kind of look at this idea of IPCAs and the momentum that is being created across Canada and across the world about Indigenous-led conservation as just an opportunity to advance and really expand on what Indigenous communities have already been doing and already are doing. It's an opportunity for me through the Challenge Fund and the land IPCAs we're working on with the Mi'kma'ki communities. There's 7 areas that our communities have identified in Nova Scotia that we're working in collaboration with the province and others to create IPCAs for. That was an opportunity that was kind of afforded to us by the Challenge Fund. We were already doing a lot of work with the province on resource management. This is just building on that, all the good things and relationships around governance and resource management that we've already been working towards and working on. It's just a way to kind of support and enhance and advance those initiatives. With the Marine IPCA, we're taking it as an opportunity in a different light because it's not tied specifically to a specific initiative where there's the governing body like Environment Canada is kind of coming and saying, well, here's the time frame that you have to work within, here's specific things that you're allowed to work on, and there's a lot of like restrictions and direction from them on what's allowed and what's not. So good stuff still happening in that. Advancements still being made, but the approach we want to take with the Marine IPCA, we made a kind of like conscious decision in it, like not to apply for government funding to support that, because we wanted to do it on our own terms and in our own timeline. And we really wanted to take the time that we felt was necessary to really build those governing structures and that community engagement process so that we can really determine from our own, like what it is that we're trying to achieve, what our aspirations, what our community's aspirations are for a really Indigenous protected area. What does that mean to us? So we're kind of taking 2 approaches. One is the one where we're working with partners, we're working with government funding. It's, but the other one we're taking is kind of like almost like, you know what, we're just, at some point we just declare this area as an IPCA because we've been leading resource management in the Bredor watershed for a number of years already. So, and I would dare say First Nations across Canada, a lot of them are in that same position. You're already doing a lot of that work already. There's a lot of similar organizations and resource management organizations and community-driven projects and programs around just look at what the stuff that Marilyn Baptiste is doing, and Steven and Eli, they've all done that before. The terminology around IPCA was kind of like made popular, or is like kind of the flavor of government today. It's something that's innately inherent to what our communities are already doing. And an IPCA is just, to me, it's an opportunity to really advance what we're doing. It's like, you know what they say, you make hay when the sun is shining, and right now the sun is shining on Indigenous-led conservation, and there's so many partners that are there and willing and excited to be a part of that. And there happens to be a lot of government money floating around, and it's like at this moment, things can change very quickly with turnover of different government and different things and priorities and funding. So I just say, like, do your best now to really take advantage of this opportunity that IPCAs and discussions around IPCAs are presenting. And I know Eli will probably talk more about this, but I know we have a set amount of funding and a specific time frame for this, but the CRP is really working towards creating some legacy projects that really are going to bring this past that. So we're not depending on the whim of government. And I don't know if you want to touch on that, Eli, if that's a good time to bring that up.
I think Steven put his hand up first, but I don't know. Steve, you want me to?
I'm not the moderator, so.
Moderate there, Monica.
Go for it, Steven.
It's a free for all.
Well, just to elaborate, every Indigenous government, nations or government have the inherent authority to create, to manage their lands the way they want to manage it. IPCAs is a term that we created through the IISAAK committee working process, is to describe what that could be. We indicate in that report that all Indigenous nations should have the opportunity to protect their special places in their territories in the way that they've and be able to use it the way they've always used it. If they don't have the capacity, but they have the desire, then they could delegate their leadership. But if they have the capacity, all Indigenous nations should be the leaders in the establishment of their own protected or conserved areas within their territory. The size and complexity of those jurisdictions will determine if you want partners or not. In our case, in Xeni and Dene, we started off with an area of interest of 55,000 square kilometers. When we invited Parks Canada, and we invited Parks Canada to look at potentially partnering with us, they agreed, but in an area of interest of 33,000 square kilometers. The reason why we chose Parks Canada is for, well, three main reasons. Well, we have a treaty with Canada. The type of protected area that the elders wanted was the best, the hardest type of protection. Parks Canada legislation provided that. And they have the financial resources to support a conservation economy around tourism and marketing. So we chose Parks Canada. We did invite Xeni Gwet'in to the table when we started negotiations in 2010. They were going through their own negotiations, their own land claims, as I call it, the devolution of administrative responsibility of Crown lands in the Northwest Territories. They reached that in 2014. In 2015, they joined the table, and together we were able to create a 26,000 square kilometers of land. We respected Xeni Gwet'in's position of excluding some high mineral potential, because my people are not adverse to development. Many of our people are working in the mining industry, but we needed the laws that are respected in Canada by industry and by settler societies. And that's the reason why we partnered with Crown government. It's hard to defend quantum of land the size of 26,000 or 33,000. That's the reason we partnered with Crown governments. And it's also to fulfill our treaty relationship. And it allowed us to further define our relationship, which bodes well for other areas of our territory, which is we still have another 174,000 square kilometers within our traditional territory that we need to manage. But I could get into more details. Join us.
The next webinar.
The webinar after that. It was the third webinar, I think.
Yes, sorry. Thanks, Stephen. So, Eli?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it should be noted that, 500 years ago, we never would have had tribal parks or IPCAs. It's a modern day innovation in trying to bring balance back to those relationships. And so I know a lot of this talk has, maybe my own words in particular have been about, that it's, solely Indigenous led, these declarations and how that declaration translates into the establishment. There were a lot of, it needs to be noted that there was a lot of non-Indigenous peoples that were standing at the blockades as well, the peaceful blockades in 1984. Many allies who shared our concern. In fact, employees of the logging company itself, who was poised to clear-cut log 90% of that island, they came on side with us. And so in a way, that tribal park itself for reconciliation long before. And so I just, wanted to say that. And then what Lisa had mentioned is about the long-term legacy. The lifetime of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which is hosted by 3 organizations. The University of Guelph is the academic host, but the 2 other hosts are the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which Steven, represents in the partnership. And then the IISAAK OLAM Foundation is another host partner. We have, I'd say, 6 years left in our mandate because year 2, which we're in, has been kind of, stymied a little bit with the whole COVID scenario. And that really does jive well with the broader aspirations of the government to get to 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. And one of the lasting legacies that Lisa had, mentioned is the creation of an IPCA, a Canadian Association of IPCAs, which could essentially act as a national secretariat to support IPCAs, whether it's funding or training, capacity development, whatnot. So that work is underway. And then also the solutions bundle mentioned by Marilyn and IPCA centers of excellence or places of learning, in partnership with different post-secondary institutions across the country. And, not for this webinar, but perhaps for another webinar, we should look at a pre-post-mortem of the target 1 and why we didn't get to 17%, because December 31st, 2020 is right around the corner and we're nowhere near the 17%. And so there's something to be learned there. What went wrong since that ceremony on March 27th, 2018 with Minister McKenna? What's gone wrong since then? Not to point fingers or cast blame, but to learn from that so that we can improve and then be more successful in achieving the 25 and the 30. So I'll just say that and stop talking.
Thanks, Eli. And thank you all. I mean, there are questions there we didn't get to. Clearly, we're at the beginning of what will be a very exciting webinar series and conversation. I would encourage you to go to the CRP website. There is quite a lot of resource material there for following up. But I'd like to hand back in the remaining time that we have to Elder Larry McDermott for some closing words. Thank you, Larry.
Xeni Gwet'in, just a quick reflection, very strong presentation, lots of food for thought, and of course, sitting here, I know how much more is behind the story that each one of the presenters shared with us today. And for that, I say Xeni Gwet'in. And I'll just close very quickly because I know we're very close to the end of our time. And I'm glad this has been recorded. I hope in the chat box, the connections and links that participants are offering are also accessible by all of us, because I'm seeing some very interesting dialogue. I made just one connection a minute ago, and I'm just going to say that we have prayers, honor songs. Some of those honor songs were shared March 27th, 2018 with the transfer, both the oral and written transfer of We Rise Together in Canada's Conservation Vision. But in those honor songs, we honor the sacred responsibilities transferred to us at conception. Our responsibility to not only celebrate life, but work together, embracing ethical space, embracing those 7 gifts, in strategizing how we can do our part to ensure that life continues. And I'm honored to be part of doing just that, and I feel that presenters, participants alike have all put their energy into this sacred circle to do just that. A quick answer to Eli's question, which I hope we explore in much greater depth, but the only way in creation something is kept alive is to continue to polish the bundle. And I feel that government didn't understand that. They didn't understand the commitment that they were engaging, but I feel that there are hopeful signs, and that they better understand that commitment, and the work that each and every one of you is doing is keeping that fire alive. It's the spirit of that fire is so important that we feed that spirit. So that's what we've done today, and I think I had a more in the language closing, but I think that's it. Other than I want to say, Xeni Gwet'in to Miʻkma'ki, the eel, Lisa's story, those animals that protect the spirits of the water and the land that we have relationships with. My prayer would have gone there. Xeni Gwet'in to all of our ancestors for keeping the land well in order that life continues and that we have this opportunity. So I wish everyone stays safe and healthy, your loved ones, and Xeni Gwet'in for sharing.